All right, we would like to welcome everybody out to our third session of 5 for our Livestock Producer Education Nights. I'm Josh Dallin from Box Elder County, and I'd like to introduce my co-host Jake Hadfield from Cache County. We're going to turn the time over to Jake in just a second to go through some housekeeping items. But we would like to give a warm welcome to Dr. Matt Garcia, our USU Extension Beef Specialist. Matt has a vast knowledge in herd management of beef cattle, and we're very, very fortunate to have him here presenting for us today. This will be recorded. It will be available for later viewing for any of you that would like to go back and review anything, or if you have maybe some producer friends that aren't available to make it tonight, we suggest that you link them right back to the website where you joined tonight. That is where this link will be probably a day or two following this meeting. So without further ado, we're going to turn the time over to Jake, and then we'll turn the time over to Matt. Thank you.
Thanks, Josh. I don't know if you guys saw, I shared a mental health survey link in the chat just a little bit earlier. Here at USU Extension, we're trying to develop some resources for some mental health aids specifically for farm and ranch families. And so if you guys can just take a second to fill out that survey, it really helps us to know what the needs actually are and what resources we can develop to be able to help farmers and ranchers. I will also say, as you know, since this is an extension event, we're going to have a lot of evaluations. So before you guys leave tonight on the meeting, just remember, we're going to send out an evaluation just to get your thoughts on the meeting. These evaluations, one, help us to keep these programs running, but it also helps us to know, we ask you for advice on just what topics we can talk about, as well as how we did, just so we can be able to better improve these programs for you guys. So with that, I'll turn the time right over to Matt and let him start presenting. So.
Okay, so I guess we all understand that we are currently in a drought, have been in a drought. Unless something drastically changes in the next few months, we're going to be in a drought again. So tonight, I'm just going to talk about some strategies that hopefully we don't get to, but it's something that we need to be thinking about. Just like we always talk about, it's better to be proactive with these types of things than reactive. So tonight, I'm just going to be talking a little bit about herd management during drought, some different strategies. But I think the major focus tonight, especially because we're going into our second, some places our third year of drought, is some of our herd reduction / retention strategies that we could maybe utilize during this time. Now, we all know what drought is. Drought has effect on pretty much everything in our system, especially in the Intermountain West. Obviously we have decreased precipitation. And when I was actually down visiting with Kevin, this drought effect actually has an effect on dry tanks if that's your major source of water out on your range. If they're not getting filled up annually somehow, even if there's grass out there, it's unusable for the most part. But the main part where we think about drought is we think about that decreased forage availability, which means not only do we have decreased forage, but that means we can run less animals, we can run them for less amount of time. But as Dr. Thacker often says, if we graze that pasture too much, we can get to the point where we cause root damage to those plants, and they might not come back at all, or they might not come back as vigorous that next year. Now, the one thing I want to start off with and really kind of hope hits home right away, that drought is a multiple year effect, not just the drought event, especially, if we think about it now, we're in multiple years of drought, but that effect is going to be seen for years down the road for us. It's going to affect our own production. It's going to affect the economy. It's going to affect a number of things even after the drought is over. Now, some of the potential effects on animals, obviously, the big one we see just because of the decreased amount of forage is reduced pregnancy rates. We got to remember that reproduction, whether in the wild or domestic animals, it's a luxury event. If they're not able to meet their own physiological needs, reproduction is the last thing that's going to happen for them. Now, the other big thing we see that's directly correlated to this is loss of body condition score. If there's not a lot of feed, there's not high quality feed, that animal will actually start reducing its fat stores, especially if she's got a calf on her. She's gonna lower, her own body condition score. And if we see cows that during a drought event that don't have that forage, we're also going to see some of those cows wean calves that are lighter. Now, there's a couple reasons they're going to do that. They're going to decrease their milk production. The second that their nutrient status starts going down, we're going to see that milk production go down. We're going to see some cows just plain and simply dry up. They're not going to have milk to give those calves. So in essence, what you're having in a lot of these drought situations with these cows that are affected is you're having an early weaning on those calves. And it's just a natural weaning. It's a very harsh weaning because it's usually pretty sudden. So if you think about this and you look at this graph over here, all of these things are directly tied together. And drought can be the major contributor to why this is happening. Now, there are some consequences in terms of reducing populations, and then there's long-term effects on your production system in terms of selling your populations as well. Now, if you get to the point where you're having to depopulate or reduce herd size, if you've had animals in your system for multiple generations, you're selling system production adapted animals. So animals that have adapted to your system, that you've selected to be successful in your system, and you're selling them off. This is where we're starting to get, some trouble here if we're having to depopulate. Now, the other thing you're typically doing is you're selling some of your young animals. Now, in theory, if we're doing our breeding systems correctly, our young animals should be our absolute best animals in our herd. And then the other economic impact of this is you're selling at the same time that everybody else is selling. So, the market's pretty saturated with cull cows, just like we saw in 2013 when Texas depopulated. But the other problem is when the drought is over and you're trying to get back in and reestablish populations, you're repopulating when everyone else is repopulating, meaning the demand for cows, far exceeds the supply at that point, because at that point everyone's depopulated. Now you're buying pretty much whatever you can get your hands on. Now I'm going to go over some different strategies here tonight, just kind of briefly. Supplementation, that's usually one of our first strategies to drought. We're going to replace that range forage with something else. Identification of new grazing resources. Maybe we try to pick up a new lease or take our animals somewhere else where that hasn't been grazed recently or might have a better forage stand than what we currently have. And then dry lot or feedlot maintenance. And we saw some of this, I think it was 2 years ago. We actually had some producers that actually shipped their animals out to the Midwest and were actually feeding them in a feedlot setting during drought. Now, the one we're really going to really focus on here tonight, though, is herd reduction or our depopulation strategies. So in essence, we're reducing the herd in order to keep a viable herd together, but also not overutilize resources. And I'll talk a little bit about in each one of these scenarios how there is a multiple year event or effect on this, whether we want to admit it or not. And it's usually an effect that's going to last well beyond the drought. Now, supplementation, this is usually our first strategy. We have decreased forage in the field or in the pasture. So we're going to increase supplemental feed to account for that loss of grazing resources. Now, usually this is an instance where we think, we can feed our way through this, and we're not going to depopulate at this point. We're going to try to feed our way through. We're going to have minimal depopulation. The problem with this is if you're doing that and the drought is bad, once again, there's other producers doing it. So that demand for hay goes up, which usually means, price of hay goes up as well. Now, the other thing that needs to be remembered about this as well is during drought, our animals aren't getting a lot of their vitamins and minerals. So just supplementing a lot of times, we will have animals that, become less efficient because mineral and vitamin status isn't being met. Particularly on our vitamin status, vitamin A and vitamin E, which are directly correlated to calf health, fertility, and the thing is where they get those vitamins is in, green leafy forage. So if we're not having a lot of green leafy forage, or we have it just for a short period of time, more than likely they're deficient there. So even though we're doing animal health, even though we're doing supplementation, we might be having some problems keeping those cows efficient. Now, the other problem with supplementation is the most expensive strategy we can implement. Hay is really our highest cost, and if we're going to increase the amount of hay we're bringing in, this is going to increase our production costs for that year. Now, identification of new grazing resources. This is something that I think, a lot of people think is easier said than done type deal. Basically, we're going to identify new range pastures, forage resources, and we're just going to utilize those. Well, one of the problems with this is if you're in a drought, like we've seen in the Intermountain West here, what do the alternative pastures look like? Even if they haven't been grazed, more than likely they're not super high quality. But this is also another costly strategy, because if you're looking for pasture, everyone else is looking for pasture. So, people with that pasture know that they can increase the price on that and, charge a premium rate to use that. Now, the problem with this is if they're in a drought, you're in a drought, what does that new pasture actually look like? How long can you stay on that pasture? More than likely, you're not going to be able to stock a normal rate out there that, you would have in normal years. You're probably going to be out there for a shorter period of time, which means, you're moving out there, it's a temporary resource, but you have to pull off early. So is that cost justified? Are you maintaining the productivity of your herd by moving them out to another pasture that's drought affected? That forage is probably not the highest quality. So basically, are you paying for your animals to have fill rather than productivity in this situation? And typically in this situation as well, you're still increasing your supplementation costs. So your supplementation is still going up. You're just doing it in a different place. Now, the dry lot or the feedlot maintenance, this is a strategy we saw some producers utilize a couple years ago, and some might still be utilizing it. But it's just where we're sending animals off to be fed or maintained in a feedlot setting during drought. In this instance, basically, you're paying someone else to supplement your herd. They might have the resources available. Obviously, there's a cost associated, but there are some good things that can be gleaned from doing this. And one is that the herd, in theory, should come home in good body condition score. They're obviously going to be on a higher nutrient plane. They're not going to be expending a lot of energy looking for feed. They're going to have that nutrient plane that's good enough to raise a calf, and hopefully rebreed by the time they come home. And then the other good thing is you're resting that pasture. That drought impacted pasture, you're not providing additional stress to it where you might be doing root damage or soil damage. So, there's an added benefit there. Now, there are some disadvantages. The major one is cost. This is a little bit more costly strategy, and maybe this is a strategy that ties in directly with depopulation as well. Maybe you're only sending what are deemed your elite animals to the feedlot. So you're not feeding the entire herd, but you're feeding your premium base of your animals. Now, the other disadvantage of this, though, is when those cattle come home, even though they've been fed for that period of time, when they bring them home, if that drought event is still going on, that pasture hasn't had the moisture, the precipitation, or has adequate recovery, when we take those cows out of that feedlot with that high quality feed, we bring them back, more than likely their rumen is not going to be completely adapted to that pasture, but also they're going to be expending energy because now they're having to go out and search for food. So that even though we bring them home, they're good in body condition score, and even though we might be feeding them a little bit, they might lose some body condition score when we get home. All right, so now let's get to the tough part, the herd reduction. And usually this is kind of a last resort in a lot of senses, because either we can't afford that increased production cost of supplementation, we've been in drought for too long, our pastures are just burned out. There's a number of factors that contribute to this herd reduction. But when we're reducing herd numbers, and I don't like using the term depopulation. The term depopulation to me means, we're getting rid of everybody. Herd reduction, I think what we're trying to do is we're trying to get rid of the animals that are increasing our production costs and not paying any bills. So when we're reducing numbers, our goal is to, keep our supplementation cost efficient. We're not going crazy, increasing our supplementation costs dramatically, but we're also maximizing our supplementation. We have cattle that might be out there grazing, a little bit. So since we have less numbers, we're able to rotate a little bit more efficiently utilize our pasture in combination with our supplementation. Our range health is a little bit easier to maintain because we got less animals putting pressure on it. But our retained cows, in theory, are still productive. And while we're most likely going to still have an increased production cost, we're not going to have that dramatic increase in production cost as if we had maintained everybody in the herd. Now, we need to understand that there's both an economic and a production cost to herd reduction or depopulating. Now, the economic cost, obviously, we might be selling animals that might not have reached profitability. And we're talking about our young cows here. Now, remember, if we're doing things right and we're really breeding correctly, our young animals should genetically be our most optimal animals. These are animals that might have the genetic potential to, address some issues that we're having with our herd, some production deficiencies. But the problem is they got to stay in the herd and prove themselves. Now, we all know that even on good years, our heifers or our 2-3-year-olds, those are the ones that typically fall out. So, we might have to sell those, even though we've invested a lot in developing them, just because they're not going to pay any bills, and more than likely they're not going to make it through the drought. Now, the other problem economically, once again, if you're selling because you don't have resources or resources are too expensive, everyone else is too. So the market's going to be saturated with culls. When the market gets saturated, prices go down. Now, once again, we all know, we saw what happened in 2013 with Texas when they basically liquidated the state of beef cattle. And then in 2014, when everyone was trying to repopulate, prices were through the roof because replacement animals, the demand just exceeded the supply. I was at an auction watching, these old cull cows going for $275 a pound. So, I mean, it was unheard of. You're going to pay a lot more to repopulate, and more than likely you're going to have to repopulate with less animals just because of cost and availability. Now, the other problem economically is if you have cows that struggle to make it through the drought, more than likely they're not going to be that productive that next year. This is where that multiple year effect comes in a lot of cases. That cow, because she was affected by that drought, or she wasn't able to sustain, or whatever happened, she's also going to be unproductive that next year. So she might have a smaller calf this year because she had that a natural wean, but she might also come open next year just because of the stress of the drought to put on her. Now, the production effects, once again, you're selling production system compatible cows. You're selling cows that have been successful on your resources in your system a lot of times. Now, if you're selling those young open cows again, maybe that's your best genetics. Maybe you invested a lot in a bull or, semen or embryos or something to really produce those young animals. But, the reality is, keeping open cows during a drought isn't a great idea. Now, when you go to repopulate, this is the next production effect, especially if you depopulate the majority of your herd. If you go to repopulate, usually you're repopulating with cows that were developed in another system. So these cows, when you get them, might look great, might look like they might fit with you, but they might not be compatible with the production system, meaning they're going to have decreased longevity, meaning, they might come up open, they might fluctuate too much in body condition score. They might just not fit the system, so they might get cold there, so they never really reach profitability through production. So in this instance, a lot of times you have production costs. You have the cost of purchasing that replacement, the cost of maintaining that replacement, but sometimes you don't actually get the added benefit of having a product associating with that. Now, I just put this slide up here. I've used this a number of times, and this is just what I'm talking about when we're repopulating. You get this cow, over here in year one, big, pretty cow raises a big, pretty calf. She's using your resources, still kind of droughty. That next year, she did her job that previous year, but now she's open. A lot of producers will say, I'm gonna keep her. It's just a sign of the times with the drought. Well, the problem with that is she's still using your resources. So basically, those two calves she weans, by year 3, you got to divide that by thirds because, she's only raised 2 calves in 3 years. So it's really not that profitable of a situation. Oops. All right. So in terms of strategies, one of the first strategies we typically use is the early weaning of calves. Now, this is a great strategy in some instances if you want to maintain those cows. If you're thinking, I want to keep these cows, I want to make sure that they're productive through this drought, I'm going to try to help them along. By early weaning those calves, you're reducing the nutrient demand on the cows. They're no longer lactating. They can allocate more of those nutrient resources to their own physiology rather than to lactation to maintain that calf. And the other good thing about this is that if we remove those calves, those cows will begin to cycle. If you look at a lot of our AI programs, there's a 48-hour, especially the timed AIs, there's a 48-hour weaning period there. The reason for that is the presence of the calf is actually what causes her not to cycle. It's not lactation, it's the presence of that calf. So if we remove those calves, she might start cycling earlier, which means we can actually maybe, if she's in good body condition score, get her bred a little earlier so that we might match resources a little bit better. But it's a good thing to remove that calf in terms of if we're going to maintain those cows. Now, this is something that is a big topic right now in a bunch of in drought places, and that's whether you maintain those calves or you sell them right after weaning. Now, in our current situation, if you're maintaining those calves, you're keeping them on your place and you're going to try to raise them up and background them to the point where they're going to reach a weight where you would have naturally sold them, more than likely you're going to have much higher production costs because you're essentially feeding your cow herd and now you're feeding a calf crop. So in that instance, you might get some more profit out of it because the cows are heavier. But once again, remember, if you're early weaning and there's drought, a lot of people are liquidating cattle. So you're increasing your production costs, and the reality is you're going to be marketing calves into a saturated market. Now, the other strategy is, which a lot of producers don't like, is you early wean and you sell those calves, get them off the plates. Now, more than likely, you're going to be selling smaller calves, but the mother is more likely to rebreed, so you get that added production benefit. But you're also selling those calves, hopefully at a time, if you're watching markets where the market isn't completely saturated. So maybe you're getting a little bit more those lighter calves than you will if you wait a few months and then try to market those older calves. And in this instance, you're not increasing your production costs because you don't have feed costs for these calves. Now, this is another big question of who goes and who stays. And this is the typical scenario is, do we sell the young cows or the older cows? Now, we'll get into what an older cow is defined as here in a little while, but the first thing when we're looking at reducing our herd for drought, the opens have to go. Whoever is not pregnant needs to go. They're going to be utilizing resources, and if we're supplementing and we're finding pasture, we're doing that, she has to be able to produce a product to cover some of that cost. Now, who goes is really a producer's decision in terms of young versus older cows a lot of times. Producers really know which cows fit their system best. But my advice is still, all opens need to go. You don't want to be maintaining an open cow. Now, the main goal of this depopulation, once again, is to maximize profit, decrease loss, and remain remain productive and keep our range resources healthy. This is a major task right here. And sometimes this depopulation, this herd reduction is something we have to do this. Obviously this is a strategy every single year, to maximize profit, decrease loss, and keep our range healthy. But during drought, it's even more imperative because it's very much easier to damage our range resources, very easy, to increase our loss by increasing our production costs and decrease our profit. Now, that being said, the animals that you keep in this system are going to impact your ability to remain profitable and decrease loss. Now, in terms of young cows being the ones we choose to sell, once again, potentially these are your best genetics. They may have the potential to dramatically improve your herd in the future, but the thing we got to remember is one calf does not make a proven cow. If she's a 2-year-old, she calves, she has a big, beautiful calf, that doesn't mean she's going to do it next year. You got to remember something about these young cows. Not only do they have that nutrient demand of having a calf on them, but they also have a growth component still. They're still growing till they're 4 or 5 years old. So if they're not meeting all these demands, they're not going to rebreed. That's why we see a lot of our 2, 3, 4-year-olds, come up open, even though we're trying to take care of them. So once again, that one calf does not make a proven cow. She's unproven in your production system. She may not have longevity, and she may not be resilient for multiple years of drought. And just because she has those added demands of growth, uterine involution, lactation, but now we throw drought on top of that. Being a heifer and incorporating into a herd is hard enough, but now you throw drought on it, that's a whole different thing. Now, the other problem is drought might actually inhibit their ability to reach their genetic potential. She may have those awesome genetics that you think are great, but we got to remember, there's got to be resources there for her to meet that genetic potential. If those resources aren't there, mainly forage resources, she's not going to meet it. So, it might be a situation where you have to decide, maybe, I incorporate these genetics next year when the drought's over or something. Now, older cows. Now, a lot of publications, if you look at a lot of academic publications, a lot of them will say, you should sell the old cows first. Okay. What is an old cow? Is it a cow that's 10 years old? Is it a 20-year-old cow that doesn't have teeth? It's a very subjective measurement there. Now, I'd caution you, the old cows, might be the ones that are resilient to this. Now, these are your production system compatible animals. They might not be the best genetics that you're looking for. They might not have all the traits you're looking for, but being that they have longevity, they've probably seen drought before and remain productive. They've been through these lean times before and actually stayed in the system. Now, obviously, if they're old, they have no teeth, they're going to need extra resources to make it through the next year as compared to the other cows. You should probably cull them. They're going to be a problem. They're not going to be cost efficient. But remember, we old cows are kind of what we go for in our herds. We need cows to have longevity in our herds for them to be profitable. Remember, on average, that cow needs to remain in your herd for 5 or 6 years to become profitable. Now, if she falls out before then, that's money that you lost in developing that heifer. But if she stays past that, that means she's adapted to your system. So, I'd caution, looking at those older cows first. Obviously, if there's some old ones that aren't able to stay in the production system, they need to go. But the older cows that are still healthy, still have teeth, that are, bred, have a documented performance, they probably need to stay. All right, so let's just kind of wrap this up real quick. I know I've taken a little bit of time here, but so when we're looking at drought, like now, we know we're in drought, we've been in drought. Be prepared and be proactive in your approach to herd management before drought. Produce select animals that are genetically compatible to your production systems. That's something we should be doing every year. We should be identifying genetics that fit our system. I tell people all the time, superior genetics does not mean compatible genetics for you. Select animals that have the genetic potential to match your resources and your production goals. They're going to be more resilient, during those lean times. If you have to depopulate, you'll have a good prime group to keep. Keep good records and know your herd so you can make accurate selection decisions. Record keeping is probably one of the best things we can do. Understand the economics and dynamics of drought for depopulation and repopulation strategies. Remember, there's both a production and an economic cost associated with both of those. Understand the complete depopulation with the repopulation strategy has impacts. And this is something that people talk about all the time. I'm just going to sell everyone, and then when the drought ceases or my pastures get better, I'm just going to repopulate. Essentially, you're selling your herd low, and you're buying your herd back high. You're also selling your compatible animals that you've selected over multiple generations, and you're replacing them with production system naive animals that are not familiar with your production system, not adapted to it. So there's going to be some cost there in terms of culls. Understand that drought has multiple years effects: animal production effects, range effects, market effects. Even after Texas depopulated in 2013, we saw record cattle prices for about 2.5 years after that. So, that repopulation strategy was very, very expensive. And with that, I'll be happy to answer any questions. I just put this picture up because I figured an optimist. I think this is what we're going to look like this summer, but I might be lying to you.
I hope that you're right, Matt. I hope that's a good prediction. I would trust your prediction better than the groundhog.
I wouldn't.
Hey, we'd like to thank Dr. Garcia for that great presentation. And we would now like to take a few minutes to turn the time over to anyone with any questions that you might have. Anything even that maybe wasn't covered, but we'd like to open it up and give you some time. It's a great opportunity that we have to have our specialists, and especially Dr. Garcia. And so, you know, you might have a question that's pressing for you at this time that you might want to take advantage of asking while you've got him lending an ear right now. So go ahead and unmute your microphones. We'll let you field those questions and stay open for that for a few minutes.
I apologize. It looked like I skipped some slides there somehow, but okay. Sorry.
Oh, I've got a question. This is Kevin Heaton down here in Canaan, Garfield County. So I'm opposite end of the state, but down here we've been hit pretty hard. And I know people have reduced, probably 20 to 30% of their herd reduction in a lot of cases. Some of them not so much, but those guys that are out on the range all year round have reduced quite a bit. I saw some statistics today that indicated that 46% of the nation's cow herd is in drought.
Mm-hmm.
And I was just wondering if you had heard any, I mean, what's the droughts? I mean, are people across the West, are they depopulating their herds to that same extent? What's everybody else's take on the seriousness of this drought?
No, I was actually talking to someone earlier today about this. And I think, you know, what you said initially is what happened. I think, you know, a lot of these states have been in kind of a multiple year thing. So they've depopulated initially, you know, reduced those herds down. But I think what, you know, a lot of these producers are doing right now, especially that 46% that's under drought, is in typical fashion, we're gonna wait and ride it out. We're gonna see what actually happens. You know, if you talk to a lot of these producers, they'll say, well, I'm gonna wait and see, you know, what my pasture looks like this spring, and then I'm gonna make a decision whether I need to populate further. From the people I've talked to, it looks like we're gonna see a pretty significant depopulation this summer. So we're gonna see quite a few animals enter the market as culls.
Matt, in your presentation, you talked about, you know, one of the options is to try and ride it out by maybe purchasing feed and extra supplementation. I've talked to a lot of guys that normally are selling a lot of hay right now, and they're pretty nervous. What would you recommend? What are your recommendations as far as right now in our situation with this drought? I mean, do we try and stockpile as much as we can? Do you think that we'll be okay? I mean, we don't want to do that reduction as you talked about, but
right.
I do know a lot of our cattlemen that are also hay producers. In talking, people are trying to find hay, and it's getting hard.
Yeah, I was talking to some people, and usually I'd say, you know, you'd probably want to, you know, start building that stockpile. Some of the people I've been talking to, especially as you go further south, that are producing hay, they turned off water early last year, so hay crops weren't as good either. But I can assume, and this is just my assumption, that they're going to turn the water off even earlier this year for a lot of those guys who are irrigating. So not only is there going to be less hay available, but I think the cost is going to go up just because of the demand and just the supply that's there. I don't know. That's a tough deal. You know, I grew up in a production environment, and you hate to sell animals before you have to, whether it's early weaning or even your breeding animals. And, you know, as a producer, the second you start selling those breeding animals is when you really kind of set yourself back years, because those are animals you've selected. Those are animals that fit what you want to do. If you get rid of them, you're essentially starting over from the beginning. So I don't want to give a recommendation on that.
Well, I appreciate that, though. I think that struck me. That's some wise counsel, and I think that we often forget about that. Even, I mean, I'm a sheep producer. Don't harm me. Don't throw virtual snowballs at me. But that's something that we often forget. It's really easy to sell out, and then go back to that ground zero, and you have. That's wise wisdom as well, to think about all those years of selection, and there's a reason why they're still there. They've been doing good,
Right.
those types of genetics. So no, I appreciate it.
Well, I think that also goes back to that concept of record keeping too, because if you're having a downsize, if you have those records, who comes in a little thin every year, or who's lambing or calving late, or whose offspring gets sick every year. Maybe those are the ones that you start culling off initially, just to keep those prime animals as long as you possibly can.
Thank you. All right. Do we have any other questions for Dr. Garcia? Go ahead and unmute your microphone.
So this may be more of a comment than a question, but I find it interesting that during drought, we're culling down, and we're probably culling the worst of our cow herd. And then when we come out of the drought, we typically have permit numbers to fill. And so a lot of times we're taking whatever to fill those permit numbers, and just because we need the numbers rather than the quality. And it's an interesting dynamics that we operate under, and it sure be nice if we didn't live by that, but that's the way it is.
And usually we're paying premium prices for those animals we normally wouldn't have bought either.
Yeah, absolutely.
I know I've done it.
All right. Any further questions? Okay, we'd like to remind everyone, as Jake did at the beginning, that we do have an evaluation link in our chat box there. Please take the time to fill that out. It'll take you 1 minute. The other thing I think that's really important on there, as Jake mentioned, is there's an opportunity for you to type in what type of other topics, future subject topics that you'd like to see in these education clinics. Please fill that out and let us know so that we can tailor to your needs and make sure that we provide that type of information to you. If there aren't any further questions, we're going to go ahead and stop our recording.